The Woman Who Wasn't There. A remarkable story about Tanya Head. They say that day was captured on camera more than any other in history. The only images widely withheld by mutual agreement were the photographs of people jumping from the windows. You're on ScandX. This is where we talk about what people usually stay silent about. On that day in New York, the deadliest terrorist attack in modern history took place. Nearly 3,000 people were killed. The suffering endured by those who survived the burning and collapsing towers is impossible to put into words. September 11, 2001 became one of the most tragic days in the history of the United States and the world. Those who survived united and created an organization to share their stories and help each other cope with the trauma. But can we believe everyone who claims to have been inside the Twin Towers that day? At 8:46 a.m., a hijacked plane struck the North Tower of the World Trade Center. The impact blocked all entrances and exits above the crash site, trapping more than 1,300 people. 17 minutes later, a second hijacked plane struck the South Tower. Because of the angle of the impact, one stairwell remained intact, allowing people below the 78th floor to escape. Those above that level were far less fortunate. It is not known exactly how many people were trapped in the upper floors. Only 19 survived from above the impact zone in the South Tower. 18 of them were rescued by a 20-year-old man named Wells Remy Crowther, who lost his life while saving others. 5 years later, one of those 19 survivors, Tanya Head, helped organize a documentary about the nonprofit group created by survivors called the 9/11 Survivors Network. Her story was meant to be the centerpiece. She claimed she had been on the 96th floor of the South Tower that morning, working for Merrill Lynch. She described hearing the first explosion and watching the North Tower burn. She said her fiancé, Dave, worked in the North Tower near the point of impact. She spoke about people jumping from the windows. She described descending the stairs, waiting for an elevator, and then being thrown against a marble wall when the second plane hit. She claimed she lost consciousness after witnessing her assistant killed by flying debris. She described waking amid fire and bodies, crawling through smoke, and being rescued moments before the tower collapsed. She said she regained consciousness 6 days later in a burn unit. Her fiancé had died. Her detailed emotional account moved everyone who heard it. She became a symbol of resilience. The hero survivor Tanya threw herself into helping others. She organized therapy sessions. She led tours at Ground Zero. She met with politicians. She advocated for memorial access. Survivors admired her strength. Many compared their own trauma to hers and felt weaker by comparison. She seemed tireless, but small inconsistencies began to surface. A scar on her arm did not look like a burn. There were no public records confirming her employment at Merrill Lynch. No one could verify her engagement to Dave. The hospital where she claimed to have been treated could not be confirmed. Then journalists began investigating. The investigation. The New York Times discovered that none of the 19 documented survivors above the impact zone in the South Tower included anyone named Tanya Head. They contacted Dave's family. They had never heard of her. There was no record of their relationship. Her background began to unravel. Her real name was Alicia Esteve Head. She had not even been in the United States on September 11, 2001. She was in Spain. Her identity, her injuries, her fiancé, her survival story, all of it had been fabricated. The aftermath. For 6 years, she had lived among real survivors, sharing their grief, guiding their healing, becoming their leader. When the truth came out in 2007, it devastated the community. Many felt betrayed. They had trusted her, looked up to her, compared themselves to her. She had not sought financial compensation from government funds, which made her motives even more puzzling. Psychologists later suggested pathological lying, a compulsive need to invent trauma for attention, identity, or emotional validation. After the exposé, she left New York and returned to Spain. No criminal charges were filed. A documentary, originally meant to celebrate her survival, instead became an exposé titled The woman who wasn't there. The lesson. Her story raises uncomfortable questions. Why would someone fabricate survival from tragedy? Why do people sometimes invent trauma? And perhaps more importantly, how easily do we create the image of the perfect victim? Tanya seemed to embody strength, resilience, composure, everything we expect a survivor to be. But there is no such thing as a perfect victim. And that may be the most unsettling part of this story. However, Tanya was not the only person who has ever pretended to be a victim of a tragic event. Both before and after her case, there have been people who falsely claim to have experienced trauma. In some situations, these people even managed to gain certain benefits from their stories. But there were always those who noticed inconsistencies and contradictions in what they said. Answering the question of why people pretend to be victims is not easy. Some may do it for financial reasons, especially when compensation is offered to victims of disasters. Others may seek attention, sympathy, or recognition. Some simply want to feel more important than they actually are. Psychologists also note that in certain cases, this behavior may be pathological. Some people create fictional stories about themselves without any obvious personal gain. They may invent dramatic experiences, relationships, or encounters simply to build a different identity. At the same time, it is important to remember that cases like this are extremely rare. False claims should never become a reason to doubt people who truly come forward with their stories of trauma. When Alicia's deception was finally exposed, she refused all interviews, left New York, and returned to Spain. After the New York Times published the investigation revealing the truth about Tanya Head, the board of the 9/11 Survivors Network voted unanimously to remove her from her position as president and director of the organization. The survivors were deeply hurt and angry. For 6 years, she had looked them in the eyes and told them a story that was completely fabricated. Many members of the network had believed that their own suffering was insignificant compared to what Tanya had supposedly experienced. They admired her strength and tried to measure themselves against her example. Only later did they realize that the strength they had admired was based on a story that had never happened. Despite the anger and betrayal they felt, some survivors admitted that Tanya had still helped the organization grow. She had organized meetings, brought people together, and helped many survivors begin their healing process. But the truth remained the same. None of it required a lie. Later, journalists discovered that Tanya Head's real name was Alicia Esteve Head. She was born in Barcelona in 1973 into a well-known family in Spain. On September 11, 2001, she was not in New York at all. At that time, she was studying in Spain. Some believe that she created the support group simply to help survivors at first, but later, she invented a new identity and began telling the story of her supposed survival. In 2002, she moved to New York and rented an apartment in Midtown Manhattan, one of the main business districts of the city. Eventually, journalists learned that Alicia had a history of telling exaggerated or fabricated stories even in her youth. Some former acquaintances from Spain said she often tried to attract attention by inventing dramatic situations or mysterious relationships. Psychologists sometimes describe this type of behavior as pathological lying. People who suffer from it may invent entire personal histories, including illnesses, tragedies, or important relationships. When her story collapsed, Alicia disappeared from public life. A documentary film later told the story of the deception. It was called The Woman Who Wasn't There. The film that had originally been intended to celebrate a survivor instead became the story of one of the most unusual deceptions connected to the tragedy of September 11th. Today, no one knows exactly where Alicia Esteve Head lives or what she does. For the survivors of the attacks, however, the memory of the deception remains painful. For years, they believed that Tanya was a symbol of strength, someone who had survived the unimaginable and devoted her life to helping others. Only later did they realize that the real strength belonged to the people who had truly lived through that day. And perhaps that is the final lesson of this story. There are no perfect victims. There are only real people, trying to survive events that changed their lives forever.